Welcome to RCast, the official podcast of the RChain Cooperative. RChain is a complete concurrent blockchain platform designed for maximum efficiency at minimal computational and environmental costs by utilizing proof of stake. I'm Derek Barris, the director of content for RChain. We cover a range of topics on this podcast, from the foundations of blockchain in general to the specifics of RChain, including our foundational language, Golang, as well as issues in calculus, governance, security, and the forthcoming businesses and dApp development on our platform. Please check out rchain.coop to learn more about our platform, as well as information on becoming a co-op member.
Last week, we had talked that this week we would discuss a little bit about climate change. We touched on this several weeks ago, but I thought it might be good to return, even in this venue and forum, to how blockchain and RChain specifically addresses climate. Is that an okay topic with you guys?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
awesome.
Great.
Awesome. Well, I can tell you what I'm interested in talking about, because it's been coming up in some tweets with Vlad. Vlad has been spending a lot of time on Twitter talking about governance, and in particular blockchain governance. And I'm quite keen on governance, in particular more decentralized governance, and how that relates to climate change. But let me just check in and see if that's if you guys have additional topics that you wanted to touch base on.
That's definitely good. I feel like maybe towards the end, just kind of like brainstorming all the kinds of applications that RChain could do, because I've been thinking about a lot.
Oh, cool. Well, I'd absolutely love to hear about those for sure. And it doesn't have to be at the end. You know, it's like, this is your conversation as much as it is mine. It's really ours.
Okay.
Second what Christian said, actually.
Oh, cool. So you've got some ideas percolating in your brain as well.
Not necessarily, but maybe from discussing a little bit further about. So I guess from my perspective, the biggest thing that I know blockchain can help with climate change in general is just solving a coordination problem, and I know that scope is fairly large, and I think maybe I don't even fully understand that scope. So maybe in discussing that a little bit further, I'll even come up with some ideas.
If we take coordination as the lead, then there's a clear connection between governance and coordination. So maybe we can begin there and then see where the path leads us.
Cool.
Does that sound okay?
Yeah,
cool. So one of the things that I think has been really interesting is this relationship between what's legal, or what's a notion of jurisprudence, and how that relates to a community. So Vlad in particular was talking a lot recently about whether or not there is any notion of jurisprudence that lies outside of the nation state. And someone responded that the notion of law without community doesn't make a lot of sense. You know, a law binds a community together, right? That's essentially what its function is when we're talking about law in that context, as opposed to mathematical laws or physical laws or things like that. So law is really what binds a community, and it's a specific community as opposed to, you know, all communities, you know, from here to Alpha Centauri. So I think that's a really important point. And I think it also works the other way. And this is where I think things start to get very interesting for blockchain. And that is that there isn't really a notion of community that has agency without some form of governance. So in particular, a community that has resources, common resources, and a community that can act in the world, both internally and externally. It has a form of governance. And you can try a thought experiment. So I was kind of thinking through different communities. So, and I was really looking at a whole gamut of communities, like congregations. Certainly, they have a form of governance. School bodies, certainly, they have student bodies. They have a form of governance. Even fan bases for artists typically have some form of governance once they start to have resources that they care about and start to be able to take action, such as promoting the band or promoting shows or something like that. Scientific bodies have governance. Whether you're talking about the Nobel Committee or the governance overarching a department in a university. All of these different communities, in order to be able to have agency, have a notion of governance, and that governance maybe it rises to the level of law at a certain point, but certainly it's binding. The rules that they put together are binding on the community members, right? And it's only through that agreement that those rules are binding that they're actually able to coordinate and function. I know that all sounds very abstract, but I just want to check in and see if these sort of foundational ideas make sense.
You were talking about like the development of rules from being maybe initially just standards or expectations, and then they become like binding and formalized over time.
No, I wasn't even looking at the evolutionary dynamics. I'm just simply saying, if I look at a congregation, right? A congregation certainly collects resources, right? The collections plate is passed out, for example, and then deploys those resources, for example, to buy grounds for a church or to upgrade existing church grounds or a mosque or synagogue or whatever, right? So those are all situations where the community, in order to function as a community, has to accept being bound by certain governance rules. I mean, I'm really looking for counterexamples. It's hard to imagine a community that has agency that doesn't accept certain kinds of governance, being bound by certain rules, whether you call them laws or not. They accept some governance.
Yeah, I mean that's usually the way that they kind of make themselves real and concrete is through that kind of formalization.
That language, real and concrete, I'm using the word agency. And in fact, I think we recognize a community when it has agency. And until that point, it's more amorphous. It's not a community in its own right.
Can you elaborate on what you mean by a community having agency?
Yes, so they have resources that they have to make decisions about, and they can take action both internally, amongst themselves, and externally outside of the community.
Yeah,
I think that notion of agency is kind of the dividing line. Like before a community has agency, then there isn't really a need for governance, a pressing or defining need. But the moment at which a community takes on agency, that's when there has to be some form of governance. And for me, this is critical and crucial, because what we're recognizing is that we're facing an existential crisis. I mean, we just had this article where 11,000 scientists have signed a document saying that we are in climate crisis now. And so the situation is dire, and we have to act. So there's this agency thing. We're going to have to act, and I think we're going to have to act in a fundamentally different way. What I'm all about is being able to give communities agency. So help them formulate these binding rules, and then help them monitor behavior against those rules. And this is where one of the places where I think blockchain can really, really make a difference.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting notion, and something that I've never really considered before, that you really need a community in order to establish some form of laws. And I mean, I guess to enforce them and so forth. Thinking about it like that totally makes sense, and just leads me to question, like, what exactly is a community? I mean, it's a collection of people with some similar interests, right? Or something along those lines. And we have all these different communities who have potentially similar or different goals. And that's why they form their community, to try and, execute on those goals. And I guess it leads me to wonder how all these different governing bodies over these different communities, who governs all of the governing bodies? I mean, why is there not another level of abstraction? If we can take it from the community to, a smaller subset of a governing body over that community, now we have a community of governing bodies, and why is there no, next higher level of governance over that? And I guess that also in a similar way makes me think about why the entire population of the world is not considered a community, and why is there no form of governance, over the entire population, the world community. But I guess that's kind of what you're saying, and where blockchain could help in terms of establishing some sort of governing body over the entire world community.
It certainly makes sense. And I think what you're really talking about is the principle of compositionality.
Right. Yeah, exactly. why do we stop at one layer instead of going up a little bit further?
Yeah, in layers. Exactly right. Exactly right. Yes. No, that I like that very much. And that's precisely what we're talking about, is to provide both a conceptual and an actual framework in which we can talk about composition, because composition is the only way that nature scales.
Agreed.
And so one of the things that I thought was really interesting was this connection. A community that has agency has a form of governance, and there is no notion of binding governance that isn't scoped to a community. So and then the question is, do we have notions of binding governance scoped to a community that is composable? And you just added a lovely property that I was trying to get across. It was very nicely put. The point is, blockchain provides a mechanism whereby the community can collect its sentiment. So a really good example of communities collecting sentiment are all the feedback mechanisms that we find in social media, like buttons and thumbs up, thumbs down, that kind of collection of sentiment. It isn't binding, right? It isn't a decision, but it reflects the feeling of the community.
Yeah, it's a representation of it.
Yeah, that's right. So blockchain can absolutely help with that, and I think that this is really, really important. The other thing that blockchain can help with is when you take that up a notch, right? So when you go from just the collection of sentiment to the expression of will, that's when you move from a like to a vote.
Right. Okay.
And blockchain can certainly help with that. It's not immediate, right? You don't go directly from a blockchain that can handle data at scale to a voting system, but it's an important piece of the puzzle along the way. It's sort of an underpinning of such an offering or service.
From the beginning, when I got interested in blockchain a few years ago, my main reasoning was that I pictured it as offering this virtual canvas in which we can begin like a methodical, rational exploration of how things should work. And I think what you're saying is like exactly the kind of thing that I've been thinking about in terms of getting a more transparent representation of how people are feeling and what they're thinking, and then how to translate that into collective action. So it's just, it's really cool that we're having this conversation.
I think a lot of people have intuited these notions, but they haven't been expressed explicitly and formally. It's about time that we do this, and part of the reason, I guess there are two pressures that suggest that we do this. Even if we didn't have climate crisis, bearing down on us. We do have blockchain bubbling up from underneath, which is it crosses all these jurisdictional lines, right? You can write Ethereum smart contracts that govern digital assets across multiple jurisdictional lines, and there's no way to adjudicate. Like even if they all did submit to one of the authorities, there's still problems where the judges may say this is a bad contract and there's no way to effect an action. Bubbling up from underneath is the question of jurisprudence and jurisdiction, and bearing down on us is the need to have decision-making power and authority that is restructured. That's the kind of crucible that I think we're in.
There is no precedent for something like this, so there's kind of an urgent need to figure out how exactly we shape the governance and what exactly that is supposed to look like.
Yeah, it's very much it's a big new frontier that not enough people are thinking about right now. If you had like some kind of simple example or like proof of concept in mind to explain how you're picturing this concept so far in terms of one of these small communities, how they could use a small version of what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think we do. I mean, one of the interesting points is that anytime a token is issued, we don't yet have an RChain standard for the different kinds of tokens. So I'll just use the nomenclature from Ethereum. But anytime an ERC20 token is issued, you have essentially defined what it means to join a community. You've got a wallet that can handle those tokens, and what it means to show an expression of support, and that is that you're sending those tokens to a particular address. Already, that you've got the workings of an expression of sentiment, and even potentially taking it up to an expression of will.
I was wondering like some like specific hypothetical application or something.
I thought wallets was a very, very specific application, and it's not even hypothetical. As soon as you design a token, right? Design and mint a token, then the community members are defined by those who have the capacity to receive the token and transmit the token.
Their expression of will, you're saying, is their ability to transfer these tokens amongst themselves so that people can use them to do things, right? I mean, like fundraise or something along those lines.
Right. It can be tied to other resources, but if it's not tied to other resources, that's when it's more like a like, right? That's when it's more an expression of sentiment.
Okay.
I send my tokens to this address as an expression of my support for this notion.
Right.
I know it's like the necessary initial framework for what you're talking about, but I mean, you could say the same thing about just like US dollars, and they provide a framework for sentiment and will. But I guess what I'm talking about more is like some frameworks for like building and guiding principles into a system. Because right now, I mean, like people, spend their money on a lot of stuff that really doesn't matter. We need things that like guide and incentivize people to do the right thing. Like
Yes. Sorry to interrupt, but let me just throw in an idea there and recognize that it's the U.S. government that is managing the control, the maintenance of the token system that is the U.S. dollar, and it's a reflection of the U.S. community members and their relations to external communities. How those tokens are used is a reflection of the values of the maintainers of the U.S. dollar. That's why there are anti-money laundering laws. That's why there are all kinds of KYC laws, because the U.S. government doesn't want the tokens to be used in accordance with or in certain activities. They don't want their tokens to be used to money launder. So they put in controls, binding controls on the community for the use of those tokens. But see, the thing is that to date, that kind of setting up of a token system and setting up all of the rules around how those tokens are disseminated or transferred received, all of the rules around the transmission of tokens wasn't done entirely in the fiat system by sort of heavyweight machinery. Once you have a blockchain, this all becomes much lighter weight. You can express it in code. And once you're able to express the rules around the transmission of tokens in code, then it becomes easier for much smaller communities who don't have the same kinds of resources to run Fort Knox and and have a standing army that will defend in the case of egregious misuse of resources. You shift from that very physical world, that fairly high capital intensive world, or high resource use intensive world, to something that's much lighter weight. With the press of a button, you can mint a token, and only with a little more effort, you can create a set of rules that govern how tokens are transmitted or disseminated within the community. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that leveling the playing field is huge.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Because now it means that any smaller community, and the other thing is they no longer have to depend upon anyone, right? If there's a global computer, if our chain is a world computer, right, that can't be taken down because every time you shoot a node in the head, two more take its place. Once you have such an infrastructure, then any community can create these systems which help them codify their values. That's a big shift it's not the end of the evolution of governance. It's the very beginning of the evolution of governance, but it's a very, very big step. And I don't think that many people are talking about it like this. It needs to be talked about, but the conversation hasn't been explicit. But I think it's very clear now how we've connected a notion of, so what we've done is we've said community and governance are inextricably linked as long as the community has agency. And then we've asked, well, how does the community monitor and maintain the behavior so that it matches with the community expectations? And we've suggested that tokenization is one way that can happen. And tokenization covers a range of activities, from things like an expression of sentiment, which includes, liking and thumbs up and those kinds of things, to binding behavior like voting. And so that's all connected just to tokenization. And then tokenization is the smallest of applications that we can build on something like our chain. That's a lot to swallow. But does it make sense?
Yeah, what you just said is really big. The fact that this is going to provide the capacity for any community on any level of locality or whatever other dimension to begin to codify their values, that's really big, but it's also like really difficult, like the question of in principle, we have the technology where anybody, if they were smart enough and they knew enough programming, they could sit down and write out, their local government in like its new, better form. But, in practice, it's such a big, difficult question, about how to write a constitution for whatever you're doing. And I'm just wondering, like, how do you, we really, really need to make it easy for people to do it. There needs to be a lot of flexible framework in which people can like easily express their values.
I agree with you 100%. And I think there are a lot of really delicate and subtle and nuanced principles that come into play. Just because you can now reduce some aspects of the binding of behavior to code, so we're inching towards code as law. But as soon as you make this step towards code as law, you have to realize that that world is in many ways no different in complexity than the existing one. You know, there are problems that are halting hard. And almost certainly the coordination of community behavior will run up against, not almost certainly, certainly, the coordination of community behavior will run up against problems that are halting hard. So expressing them in code might not be possible. And going the other way, checking that you have expressed what you wanted to express in code can also be halting hard. Not always, but there will be many situations in which that's the case. And as soon as you hit that kind of situation, you know, you have to know what you're facing, right? So you're absolutely right. So there's a lot of subtlety in making that step that I don't think people understand. Just as an example, you know, if you're just thinking about whether or not you trigger a particular clause in a smart contract, well, the determination that you call a particular subroutine, it's not a panacea. When you move into a world where code is law, that's not going to solve all our problems. It will create as many problems as it solves. But what it does do is allow compositional forms of governance. The U.S. nation state, you know, it has whatever cities and counties and states and federal governments. It does have some notion of rolling up governance. You know, it's not fundamentally organized with the idea of composition in mind. If it's going to be effective and if it's going to work in such a way that we can live better on planet Earth, that it has to be built out of this notion of compositionality. The other part of this, and this is something that Lawrence Lessig talks about very beautifully, he points to this notion of acoustic separation, right? So the adjudicator puts a dividing wall as an example of this principle. To one side, you know, so to the populace, the adjudicator may say, ignorance of the law is no excuse. And what that does is it motivates the community to learn the law, to be more responsible, more engaged citizens when it comes to the what binds their behavior. And to the other side, so this is the enforcement side, the adjudicator says, actually, ignorance of the law is a pretty good excuse. If you didn't know, it's hard to say that there was intent to break the law. And so that introduces mercy into the system. And, you know, there's no mercy when it comes to a smart contract. The logic is cold. And so you have to think about systems that have forms of acoustic separation, that have forms of mercy. And so that's another principle that we have to actively think about when we're talking about forms of governance, especially in this new world where we're really looking at building up governance from the ground up. Again, that's a lot to swallow, so let me just check in and see if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you both make some really good points on this topic. One thing that I wanted to say is that I think there's kind of a sentiment out there that people are feeling disenfranchised, and especially with, like, you know, the most recent elections and you know, the level of manipulation that people have experienced in that process. One of the most important things that blockchain brings to people is it gives them the ability to really truly grapple with these ideas and to also have a measurable effect on them, as opposed to just continuing with the status quo and continuing to feel disenfranchised and like you have no power to change anything because, you know, the system is corrupt or whatever the belief is. But this kind of flips the script and puts the power back in your hands, and I think will encourage people to really think about these issues as if they're real, you know, and not just like something that people talk about.
Yes. Yeah. That's exactly right. I mean, the Christian talk to this notion of when a community becomes real, right? And I you know, again, I want to hammer on this idea that a community becomes real when it can act, and we need to be able to act now. We can't wait, right? There's a reason why there are groups emerging like Extinction Rebellion. because people, and there's a reason why people like Greta Thunberg are getting such support, and their voice is resonating with so many people, is because now is the time. This has been my hope and dream, is that with RChain, the technology is real enough that people can begin to feel themselves empowered to form communities and to act.
That's why I'm seeing law as just one aspect of this, which I'm sure y'all agree. But in the really short term, the applications that I'm really interested in are the ones that focus collective will and sentiment, because those don't necessarily need to involve any kind of binding or anything. They're just about like bringing together all these people that think the same thing but have been too diffuse or dispersed, and get them to have a serious impact. Like, for example, divestment movements. There should be a way to organize on a very large scale divestment from a certain company or something, and it should be properly incentivized.
But don't you think that once you involve incentivization, that's really a form of binding behavior? I mean, certainly a form of influencing behavior.
Maybe,
but ultimately, to get the incentives, your behavior is bound.
Yeah. So what kind of incentives? I haven't figured out what those might be in the case of divestment. Do you have any ideas?
Typically, what one wants for divestment is some kind of economic benefit, some kind of credit. I really like Muhammad Yunus's idea of social capital, and incentives that have to do with social good. When we're talking about large-scale movements, we don't necessarily get buy-in on the same notions of social good, whereas there is existing infrastructure to get buy-in on notions of economic benefit and credit.
It's got to be some kind of economic.
And as soon as it's economic benefit, then we are talking about binding behavior, I think. You're talking about some people giving up resources in order to that others might receive those resources. There's a kind of linearity here that ultimately ends up in binding behavior.
So you think like a bunch of people could get together and offer some kind of economic resources to people that divest from Chase or something?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's correct.
I'm just really curious how you can get something like that to really happen on a large scale. I feel like once everybody has this app where you can, I picture this app that first of all just makes completely transparent the flow of money and influence in the economy and politics, and you should be able to like literally just say to your phone, like, I'm going to McDonald's right now, and it pulls up everything that McDonald's has been funding, and then it like gives you alternatives. It gives you ways. It's a framework for people to start divestment campaigns and like set up their own incentive structure or something.
You should pitch that app idea to the Sunlight Foundation.
What is that?
I haven't looked into it for several years at this point, but from what I remember, the Sunlight Foundation specifically focused on politics. I may be wrong about this, but just in terms of where all of their funding is coming from, it's just like a website and organization where they display all this information publicly.
Yeah, that's cool.
I spent some time talking a little bit about governance and how I see how I connect the dots myself, and how the framework of the conceptual framework in which I'm operating. But you guys said that you had sort of a list of things that you were contemplating for how we might apply blockchain in this setting. So maybe we can change the topic a little bit and just Christian, you said you've been thinking about some things.
I completely agree with your big picture. That is going to be the main, conceptual framework that we're going to be grappling with. But I guess the reason why I'm really interested in like smaller scale, like immediate stuff is because it's such a big question, and we're going to need a lot of like proofs of concept first for how to build something so big. I'm really interested in that transparency app, and figuring out how to connect it to like organized divestment campaigns. Yeah, I was just trying to start making a short list of some other ways that our chain could help. One thing I was interested in is kind of similar to like local government governance, but more like basic decentralized communication kits, basically. Like if suddenly things go really bad in 20 years or something, like literally just making sure that we still have internet, making sure that our chain is not dependent on the fragile infrastructure of the existing internet, and like literally just getting the hardware and the physical decentralization to different communities and helping them set up their own communication networks. Have you thought about
That's
anything?
a really interesting one. Actually, yeah, Nash Foster and I thought about this a lot. His idea was that you could reinvigorate the economies of a lot of the interior of the U.S., a lot of the red regions, so to speak, by turning them into, giving them a model for data centers, right? Giving them a model to become, staking operations for validators. They build up a data center with a certain amount of compute and storage and network capacity, and then they provide access to different blockchain networks. Whether it's different shards on the RChain network or across a variety of different networks from RChain to Ethereum to EOS or whatever. With this kind of some smart engineering choices, you can kind of make this a franchise, where literally you can give a template or a boilerplate to various communities, and that could reinvigorate their economy. If they have access to cheaper electricity or a better cooling situation or a variety of these kinds of things, then they're incentivized to build out the infrastructure. And because you now have a bunch of these different communities that are building out the infrastructure, as opposed to running everything on AliCloud or Amazon or Azure or Google or whatever, you've potentially got a winning strategy. You're taking a place where there's a significant economic need and you're turning it around.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. To what extent is that depending on the existing internet infrastructure?
It doesn't have to depend on the existing internet infrastructure. I mean, you're still depending on TCP/IP. You're still depending on the protocols, at least initially, until that's worked out. But you're not necessarily depending upon the same set of major nodes for communication.
The actual like cables and cell towers and satellites by which we connect as a nation.
Right. That's what I was just saying. Yeah. So if you build out enough of these data centers, then they can become their own hubs because it's very decentralized. There's some interesting patents that will point the way to what you could do with Wi-Fi if you were serious, right? I've often thought that the end of net neutrality ought to mean that there's the end of depending upon wires. You get a truly decentralized situation if you can basically go from one Wi-Fi modem to another. You route packets over that. You might ask, well, is the Wi-Fi speedy enough to handle the load? And it turns out that you can make that kind of infrastructure speedy enough if you, guess what, introduce notions of concurrency. You do channel slicing and channel hopping that can increase the speeds of the Wi-Fi infrastructure. What that means is that no one can be in charge, right? Because now it's this giant mesh of modems that's saturating. And of course, you have to be careful, right? Because there may be environmental consequences. In theory, this gives you a way where you don't. There is no centralized cable provider. Now, there are problems with this network. But again, there may be consequences there that you don't want to. You have to explore what it means for planet Earth.
Yeah.
As you guys are talking about this idea of like kind of bringing these like data centers into different areas that maybe don't have sort of like economically viable model of sustainability or something along those lines, using the fallout might not be the right word. Well, let me use it anyways. Kind of the fallout of the manufacturing industry and all of the buildings and infrastructure that has left unused, and created massive losses of jobs and things like that. To use those as the data centers may be a good direction to at least start in. Because I mean, some of these communities have been completely devastated by the loss of manufacturing jobs, like especially in the auto industry in Ohio. I know very intimately. I mean, Youngstown and Dayton and Cleveland. I mean, there are several plants where they were manufacturing automobiles that are just completely abandoned at this point. So even something like that could provide.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So
infrastructure.
You're absolutely right, and that was kind of the thought. So what we were looking at was the fact that automation is going to decimate the work opportunities for a very, very large percentage of people. And so the idea of building out these data centers was a way to fill in some of that gap.
That's a really cool idea.
I was coming at it from a different context, I guess, a darker context that was like, if a bunch of our infrastructures or chunks of them collapse, it's going to be infinitely worse if we don't have national and global communication.
Right, but I guess the point is that those two perspectives dovetail. Yeah. That's why I was bringing it up. Was that if you look at the idea of reinvigorating local communities with new economic opportunities, and if those new economic opportunities just happen to be preparing for the collapse of infrastructure, which is almost inevitable given what we're going to experience with the fallout of climate change as it is right now, then it's a win. It's a double win.
Yeah. So I mean, how do you start a project like that? How do you even begin?
Well, I think what you do is like for example, I've got a friend right now who's working on containers that you can drop to provide internet services for remote regions. He's basically just this shipping container that has local servers and satellite uplink connections.
Oh, that's awesome.
And yeah, exactly. It's scaled down to just like an individual or a small group can purchase one of these things and provide basic infrastructure. And they were interested in running an RChain node to do a lot of the economics of the data services.
How do I find information about this?
I'll give you links. It's not at a point where it can go super public. So you could take something like that and build it out into take the architecture of one of these self-contained containers, and then say, well, what would it be like to have a farm of these? And again, you want to look at it from the perspective of if the environmental impact is worse than leaves us worse off than when we started, it's not a good idea. I did want to mention that your idea about the transparency app is actually a lot more complicated than you might think it is. It's not exactly like McDonald's is going to hand over their financials.
I thought the first step would be figure out what are the current laws, because I'm pretty sure a lot of this stuff does technically have to be made public, but they just hide it behind a lot of bureaucracy.
I mean, the same is true in the music industry, right? I mean, there are all kinds of laws that govern the dissemination of funds for use, but the music industry is still able to hide billions and billions of dollars worth of profit every year. And you can imagine that some an industry like McDonald's or the food and agriculture industry in general, they don't have a lot of motivation to be fully transparent. It's not quite as simple. I mean, it's a great vision, but to be perfectly honest, while you say that this idea of tokenization is big, I think it's big conceptually because it's such a big container. It holds lots of different things, but in terms of realization, it's actually fairly small, right? We know what it is to build a blockchain that allows for the development of a tokenization contract. That's something we can do. You know, what's big is small and what's small is big.